Hello there, good afternoon. Time for the marketplace with me, Charles Aite. Here's what's coming up this hour. Depositors of defunct microfinance and savings and loans companies set to receive all outstanding claims today as government releases 3.6 billion cedis to clear all the bonds held. Also, Ghana's economy contracts by 3.4% in the second quarter. The first time since 1983, we have details on this startling statistic. Plus, more than 2,800 jobs restored after the ease of COVID-19. We'll hear from the Minister of Employment and Labour Relations, who spoke at a Meet the Press series earlier today. You may want to stay with us on all these stories coming up shortly. First, though, let's take a breather. Be right back. Hello there and you're welcome to the marketplace. Now, some depositors of defunct microfinance and savings and loans companies are queuing at the Consolidated Bank Ghana to receive all the outstanding claims in cash. Now, this was after the government released some 3.65 billion cedis to the receiver, Eric Nananipa, to facilitate the payment. George Riafi has the details of the story.
According to the receiver, all depositors that are holding bonds as payment for all validated claims can walk into any Consolidated Bank Ghana in exchange for cash from this morning. This is to make sure the previous arrangement where a fraction of all depositors' claims were paid in cash while the remaining was in bonds spread over a period without any interest has been cancelled. The receiver in the statement released maintained that with the provision of these funds, government has been able to settle over 6 billion Ghana cedis for all validated claims to depositors of savings and loans companies as well as microfinance firms. This should bring a closure in terms of payment covering all these validated claims for these defunct financial institutions. Some depositors in the past had raised issues about this payment structure, which they argued that it wasn't good for them. The Bank of Ghana last year liquidated some savings and loans companies as well as microfinance institutions over some liquidity issues and their failure to meet some regulatory requirements.
Well, just moments after the receiver went public on this announcement, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Social Equity and Public Accountability, ASEPA, Mensa Thompson, argues that government is being dishonest about the payments of customers of these collapsed savings and loans companies. Well, he joins us with more on his views and his thoughts about this entire thing. We're so grateful that you joined us. First of all, what is it that government isn't telling us that you're much more concerned about?
Well, a number of things. If you look at the briefings in Parliament by the Deputy Finance Minister, Mr. Edubuahen, last month, they told us that about 96% of the customers of the microfinance and savings and loans companies have been paid. The President also in an address told us that about 98% of them have been paid. The Finance Minister again also repeated the same claim that 98% of the customers have been paid.
But now, there is just mathematical arguments that 98% of customers being paid doesn't equate to 98% of them being fully paid. Some of them could have received some, half the payment so far. So
the issue is this, and if I could give you a breakdown of the numbers. Now, the total number of customers who were affected were 3.2 million. So you have 1.1 for the savings and loans, and then 2.1 for the microfinance institutions. So 3.2 million customers. Now, the receiver in a press briefing told us that they've received claims for about 360,000 people. Now, out of the 360,000, they validated 297,000 of them and rejected and rejected 97,000. So 63,000.
That's based on the validation process.
So based on the validation process, they rejected 63,000 of those claims, leaving 297,000 of these customers, which they paid with cash, a mixture of cash and bonds. Now, later they came back that some 143,000 people filed claims late, and so they have, added them to the list. So in effect, if you look at the number of people who have been paid with both cash and bonds, there are about 400,000 people, which is less than 13% of the number of people who have received claims. And so we were surprised, and that's why we challenged the minister and the president's claim that 98% of the customers of these institutions have been paid. And so yesterday when we heard the announcement that these people, government has released 3.6 billion to pay these customers, we were wondering, if government has paid 96% of the customers, then who are they going to pay with this 3.6 billion that they have actually released to CBG for some payment? And so clearly you see the inconsistency.
So you feel, you argue that there is some sense of inconsistency despite the mathematical argument already that 98% of most of these customers being paid as per what government is stating does not categorically mean in quantity that they fully had the payments made them in cash, full in cash, because we do know that previously most of these payments were made in bonds, you know, and sales and whatnot. So this argument in this whole sense could be kind of jerky. But let's come down to some other issues that you've raised.
With a mixture of cash and bonds.
Exactly.
And so if you have 3.2 million customers who have been affected, and you pay a little over 400,000 people with cash and bonds, what happens to the remaining over 2 million people? What happens to them? Do they lose their investment? And as we speak, the government does not have data on 34 microfinance institutions. 34.
What's the proof?
Here's a proof. Here's a list of I can mention all of them. 34 microfinance savings and loans. Government does not have any data on them, and so they can't pay them. They haven't even done the validation or claims for even one of them. And so on what basis did the president tell us that they've paid 98% of the customers when they don't have data on 34 microfinance institutions? And that gives you a total of about 201,527,000 people who fall under these 34 microfinance institutions, who government, as we speak, do not have data on these people.
Well, we shall fact check most of these claims there, but you know, today we're seeing most of these customers receive the monies. We're having our reporters on the ground who are saying that as at now, some customers have received their funds, others haven't received their funds. What are you receiving from the ground?
Well, I think we have asked government to bring more information. I mean, just saying that you've released 3.6 billion to CBG alone cannot be. You know, first of all, you see, I think government has not been a bit transparent with this payment of customers' processes. Because, one, we need to know how many customers have been affected. Apart from the data that we've gotten, how many have been validated? How many have been rejected? How much is left? How many of these customers were paid with cash? How many were paid with bonds? One, is government telling us that the 3.6 billion is going to offset all the liabilities? So do we take it that once this 3.6 billion cedis have been given to these customers, have been given to CBG to pay these customers, does it mean that the liabilities in the microfinance and savings and loan sector is over? I think there's still scanty information what government is giving us. And just announcing that we've released 3.6 billion to CBG alone, it's not enough. We need an extensive audit. We need some transparency in the payment processes, because some of the customers have been complaining. They have not received a dime. Some of the customers even raised concerns about the fact that when government decided to pay them with bonds, they raised concerns.
I would want you to pull up the list of the 34 companies that you cite.
I can send it to your producers and they put it up.
It's important for us to fact check most of these information.
I can put it,
cross check whether or not these were registered with the Bank of Ghana.
So I can mention some of the names. We have Abyss Plus Microfinance Limited, which was closed in September 2014. We have African Trust Microfinance, which was closed in December 2015. AG Microfinance Limited, May 2017. Bedell was closed in May 2019. Bengay Microfinance, Bone, Common Capital, Noble Dream, Divank, Jeddah, all these Royal Future Microfinance, all these companies were shut down, and as we speak, government does not have data.
They were shut down on specific grounds, of which, you know, we have information on. They were shut down on specific grounds. And I mean, there could be much more arguments in terms of the information that the government doesn't have, or the BOG doesn't have on these companies,
is the data.
And even the validation processes of the customers belonging to these companies as well.
What they don't have is the data.
Which is debatable.
So the data, which is the people, for example, like maybe these are the customers of this microfinance. This is how much deposits they owe. This the liabilities of the bank. They don't have data, so they don't know who deposits what and who to pay what. They don't have that data. And if you don't have data on 34 microfinance institutions out of out of the over 300 which were collapsed, and you say you've paid 98% of the customers, then on what basis do you make those claims?
So you want much more clarity on these things. You want transparency on the
government must admit that it lied to the people of Ghana when it claimed that they paid 98% of the customers, because that cannot be true. And we believe that the fact-check team can do that. One, they don't have data on the 34 microfinance institutions. Then again, they also, what they did was that they validated claims for just 297,000 people.
Great.
Now, 297,000 people as a percentage of 3.2 million people cannot be 98%. So even if you add this to it, you realize that there's a huge chunk of people who have not received a penny from government. Yet government says that it has paid all the customers, 98% of the customers have been paid. I think clearly that was a false claim.
Debatable, but we shall be having our eyes on the ground as we interact with most of our, our reporters on the ground who are currently speaking to most of these customers, whether they've received their funds or not, to give you updates as and when we do have them. But we're so grateful for your time, Mr. Thompson, for that particular analysis there. But moving forward, Ghana's economy has recorded a negative 3.4% in the second quarter of this year. Now, the first time since 1983, that's in 37 years. According to the figures released by the Ghana Statistical Service, the heavy fall is largely attributed to some restrictions on activities in the economy, which virtually came to a standstill during the period as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. With oil, the economy recorded a negative 3.2% growth rate in the second quarter. Government statistician Prof. Samuel Kopna Aining has the details.
For the second quarter of 2020, Ghana's economy has contracted by 3.2% from an oil perspective. From a non-oil perspective, we also saw a contraction in the economy. Specifically, for the second quarter of 2020, we saw our GDP being 35,590.4 million Ghana cedis relative to 36,839.7 million Ghana cedis that was recorded for the second quarter of 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in 37 years, Ghana's economy has seen a contraction, which indicates that the last time the economy contracted was in 1983. And for emphasis, the oil sector contracted by 3.2% and the non-oil sector contracted by 3.4%. We share with you quarterly real GDP growth rates from two perspectives. By finding the average over the last 7 years, that is from the first quarter of 2014 to the second quarter of 2020, and look at how that compares with only the second quarter of 2020. From the perspective of oil and non-oil, we see that from both perspectives, as was indicated, restricting the GDP estimate to the second quarter of 2020, we saw that from both perspectives, the economy contracted respectively by 3.2 and 3.4%. Relative to what happened over the last 7 years, that is the first quarter of 2014 to the second quarter of 2020, we saw these two sectors, that is the oil sector growing by 4.6% and the non-oil sector growing by 4.1%. We do the same analysis from the three sectors' point of view by comparing GDP estimates for the last 7 years with GDP estimates for the second quarter of 2020. And with the exception of the agricultural sector that saw an expansion of 2.5%, both the industry sector and the services sector saw a contraction. Specifically, the industry sector saw a contraction of 5.7%, followed by the services sector contracting by 2.6%. Relative to what happened in the previous 7 years, for all three sectors, that is agricultural sector, we saw an expansion of 3.6%, industry sector 6.0%, and services sector 4.1%. We go ahead to share with you, because of the uniqueness of the second quarter 2020 GDP estimates, we share with you sectors that saw an expansion for the second quarter of 2020 and sectors that saw a contraction for the same period, that is the second quarter of 2020. We provide two estimates for your guidance in interpreting these growth rates across sectors that saw an expansion and sectors that saw a contraction. And these estimates are the subsectors' share of total GDP and the growth rate. The subsector that saw the highest expansion is the information and communication subsector. But it is important to realize that the information and communication subsector comes fourth in terms of the share of total GDP. We have the crops subsector that saw the highest growth, having a contribution of 12.0%, followed by construction subsector having a share of 8.5%, and transport and storage following with 6.3%. So although these three sectors have higher relative shares to GDP, they come low in terms of growth rate, and information and communication subsector that saw a growth rate of 74.2% has a share of only 5.9%.
Well, let's break down the figures now, and to help me do that is my colleague with the Joy Business Team, Assistant Editor Charles Nixon. So Charles, many thanks for joining me. How bad are these figures?
I wouldn't say the figures are bad, because if you look at the growth rate, it was a contraction. We recorded negative 3.4% for Q2. It was obvious. There was some partial lockdown, which traveled for about almost 2 months. So obviously there was virtually no economic activities. Aggregate demand and supply was virtually non-existent. So that was expected. So if you compare to the first quarter of 4.9%, it tells you that there is a lot of hope, and there had been forecast by Fitch, some economists, that we are likely to get to a level of almost 2% for this year. And that is possible in the sense that the airports have been open. There is a level of port activities. Import and export will start generating some level of activities. The hospitality sector seems to be upping its game. So there is some level of hope.
Interestingly, sorry to cut it, but it's very interesting you said there is a likelihood, and you keep interjecting with hope, because looking at global economies elsewhere, we do know that the UK is virtually also grinding towards a recession, the same as compared to other global economies as well. So where do you feel the growth pattern of Ghana could be in the future when it comes to the estimates so far?
Well, let me make a point of correction. UK recorded a very interesting growth rate for July, and that is expected to change things in their economy. However, because of the significant impact of COVID on their economy, they might not experience some higher growth. So it's likely they would hit a negative target. Globally, most of the giants are going to record negative growth rate. In Africa, Ghana looks like being the third country that will record its highest growth rate if you look at forecasts that has been done. Agri looks promising, with the exception of forestry and logging, which recorded a negative growth rate. All the subsectors recorded appreciable growth rate. You could talk of crops, you could talk of fishing subsector. That was the leading subsector within the agri sector. It was expected in the industry sector, whereby manufacturing recorded the highest negative growth rate or contracted heavily. Sure. There was virtually no demand or supply in the manufacturing subsector. Interestingly, electricity recorded the highest growth rate in the industrial subsector, because there was higher demand for electricity, and there was supply available as well within the period. Services, we all know the hospitality sector suffered a lot, and it contracted heavily, over 70, almost 78% contraction. And however, ICT recorded a 74% growth rate. That, to some extent, offset the negative growth that came from the hospitality perspective. However, other subsectors within the services sector could not record quite impressive growth rate to offset that. So going forward into the year, obviously there will be some level of activities. The elections as well brings some level of activities from the printing perspective, the ICT perspective. Because of the COVID restrictions, this year we are going to focus more on social media and the ICT avenue in terms of trying to market their brand and candidate. So hopefully there is hope. It gives some opportunity for businesses to plan.
Sure.
You can tell that if the economy is going to grow at 2% by the end of this year, it gives some hope. So therefore, when you are planning your budget, you know what you have to do in terms of what revenue or sales target, what will be your PBT or profit before tax, your operating expenses and what have you. So that gives some level of room for businesses and consumers to plan their budget for next year.
All right, great analysis. Many thanks, Charles Nixon, for the analysis that he's been giving us. Clear details into these statistics from the Ghana Statistical Service, where Ghana recorded some contraction in 37 years. Now, about 2,849 jobs were lost during COVID-19 period have been restored. Now, after the easing of COVID-19 restrictions, according to the Minister of Labour and Public Relations, Ignatius Baforia, there's been a drop of 4.5% in unemployment rate since COVID-19 restrictions were eased. Now, this is based on data from the Ghana Statistical Service. He was speaking at the Meet the Press series today.
In the economic sectors, the highest instance of job losses of 65% were recorded in the other services, i.e. recruitment agencies, media, laundry services, and other organizations within the services subsector, followed by construction, which also had recorded 40%, hotels and restaurants 45%, and private sector education 43%. The shipping maritime subsector, together with finance, agriculture, health, and social work, suffered the least incidence of losses of 1%. It is worth noting that there is no known record of job losses in the public sector as far as our records are concerned. And here I take this opportunity to express our profound gratitude to His Excellency the President for this laudable policy initiative for protecting public sector work. As indicated earlier, the rollout of interventions, gradual easing of restrictions by His Excellency the President, and the return of economic activity in the country has resulted in the restoration of some of these jobs. Out of the 11,657 jobs out of the 40,000 that were interviewed, some 2,849, representing 24% of jobs, so far been restored. So as the restrictions are eased, work jobs are also restored.
And that's how we draw the curtains on this edition of The Marketplace with me, Charles Aitik.